Good afternoon. Know some folks went out still, maybe getting a restroom break or whatever, but if you're interested in weather, I know you're probably sitting down at this point. This is my third water college with you guys down here, and it's always good for me to get from Colorado down to Texas. I've always thought Texas is my second home. We learn a lot of lessons the hard way in Colorado, especially when it comes to water. And after I speak to you guys today, I'm flying back to Denver tonight, and I'm going to speak to the Colorado Water Congress tomorrow. And my main message for them is just simply how really stupid we are as a state at this point. Because not only do we rely on water as our lifeblood in terms of population, but we have to kind of budget the fact that in Colorado, our population is exploding along the Front Range, and we are massively overextending our resources in terms of water supply, and it's just a matter of time before we have a multi-year drought where it's going to put us in really, really bad shape. And the problem with my state is we really hesitate to look just a couple of states to the west to learn the lessons, and California unfortunately has had to learn the hard way. And never before have we had more people using more water than what we have right now. So it's always a pleasure to come down here and actually get to deal with some common sense folks when it comes to water and water supply, and I appreciate you guys having me down here. So my main message today is just simply the long-range forecast and kind of what we're seeing. I know you guys are pretty in tune with the weather, so I don't have to dumb things down to you, and I throw a lot of information at you. So my contact information is at the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, comments, or whatever, just fire away. You can hit me up on Twitter throughout the presentation too. I'm on that all the time. It's just a great way to communicate. So let's go ahead and get things started where I have normal up here in quotation marks because we never really see normal. And as I say, normal is basically too much, not enough divided by 2, and that's what you get, which you never get. And that's exactly what normal is, or average. So let's look at the current status of things going on here. And this is precipitation percentage of normal during the past 30 days. And this is a little bit different from the maps that came out today because of the blizzard that happened up along I-70 and northward across north central, northwest Kansas, southwest Nebraska, northeast Colorado. But that doesn't do you guys a bit of good down here because it happened up there. And we've been in pretty bad shape down here, obviously with, in some cases, 10% or less normal moisture during the past 30 days. And if you look at that in terms of 90 days, that's what you have too. So we're not only dealing with conditions that are drier than average, we are dealing with drought expansion and drought creep, not just in a local sense, but also regionally. And if you've heard me speak about drought before, you know that I don't get too shook up about dry spells or localized drought. If your neighbor's not getting enough rain down there and you're just fine, that's not a drought. That's a drought on his place. And he's probably pissed about that, but you get my idea here. It's not anything to be concerned about unless you are that person. I look for something that is more regionally and widespread before I get too worked up. And in terms of the drought monitor across Texas, Oklahoma, South Texas is actually not in too bad a shape right now, but if you come up here in the Panhandle, we've been pretty rough. And we had plenty of moisture, last spring. Last summer was great. A lot of people were complaining about too much rain. Well, this is what happens when you complain about too much rain. You go backwards, and we are just accustomed to that. People try to make a big thing out of that. This is a desert right here. This is a desert. So where you're dealing with white conditions, where you're not dealing with drought, that's actually the exception versus the norm. It's pretty hard for somebody who's new to the country to wrap their mind around that. We are farming and ranching in a desert out here. So the chances of us having more dry years than wet years are pretty good. And if you don't believe that, you're just being stupid. And you need to adjust your business plan accordingly for that kind of thing. And you need to prepare for that. So right now, where we were last year and last spring compared to where we are this year, you can see exactly how quickly it's changed. You know that I'm a big ocean guy. I mean, when we talk about long-range weather and long-range forecasts, it starts with the oceans. with as much water as on this planet, and how that heat budget resorts and how that affects short-term regional, long-term local, global weather patterns, it's incomparable. So you have to look at this. And obviously, we're dealing with water temperatures that are cooler than average right here off the west coast of South America, which is obviously known as a La Nina episode. And that's really what's been responsible for the drought creep that's been going on across our region, especially North Texas, Oklahoma, and on up into my backyard. The other problem here, which kind of gets thrown away, is the eastern Pacific right here, especially the northeast Pacific, this warmer than average water that's off the coast of California. Well, here's the way weather works. Weather is fueled by contrasts, extremes, and whatnot. So if you have water temperatures over a wide area that are basically the same, and I know it's not the same temperature-wise, but it's warmer than average right there over a pretty wide area. So you're not getting the natural contrasts in terms of water temperature from one area to the next. The one area you do have contrast is out here. You can see it's a little cooler than average. Well, this is where your storminess is. And your storminess goes up something like this and then favors a storm track that comes up through the Pacific Northwest, Northern Rockies, and then dumps itself into the upper Midwest. This is a problem, and this is a problem that doesn't get a whole lot of attention right now. And you might say, well, here's a contrast down here. Well, what good does that do us? It doesn't do us any good. We need that contrast in ocean temperatures up here off the west coast of California so we can fuel storms, so we can make that storm track more active and increasingly more active. And until that changes, we've got some issues here in terms of water temperature. The Pacific Decadal Oscillation, this is a 20 to 30 year oscillation. A lot of you have heard me talk about this in the Pacific, and when it fluctuates, so does our weather, long term. And charting it all the way back to 2005, I could have taken this back to the 1800s too, and if you're interested, we can talk about that later, but all the way back to 2005, whenever this oscillation has been in a positive or a warm phase, we've usually done okay in terms of moisture. We haven't had many problems. When it goes negative or when it gets cold, that's when we start to have problems. How do you know that? Well, look at this. Look what happened in 10, 11, 12, 13, and then early in 14, things got better. Okay, well, we went positive, and that's when we really started to heal ourselves from that drought that was so awful. Recently, back in 16, we did okay. 17, we did okay, and then look what happened here. See how these temperatures, or at least these indices, dropped off, and then we've kind of had a little bit of a spike here in December. So the Pacific Decadal Oscillation is still in a positive or a warm phase, but it's not nearly as positive or warm as we dealt with back here in these really wet times that came on the heels of those really dry times. So we're still okay, we're just not as okay as we were in terms of these long-range patterns. And this is just kind of how the water temperature sets up here in terms of over here when it's positive, okay, there's that warmer than average water that I was showing you just a little bit ago, right? It isn't as far north on this graph, but you can see what I'm talking about right here. This is okay for us. This is not okay. When we see this stuff happen in that cooler than average water right here off the Baja, this is usually when La Ninas are not only more frequent, but they're also stronger and more long-lasting. So even when we were talking La Nina and we still have this set up, I'm not as concerned as if we had this going on in the La Nina that was ongoing. The Atlantic also has the same type of an oscillation, 20, 30 year cycle, okay? This one last flipped in 95 to a positive phase, and we've been kind of flipping back and forth a little bit here in recent times. But again, from 05, you can see that during that time, we've largely had more positive numbers than negative until here recently, and then we've tried to flip things back just a little bit. So I know a lot of you that have seen me talk before have seen me shown this chart up here in terms of drought frequency. McCabe came up with this in 2004. It's very important for, I show this a lot to younger farmers and ranchers that may have not have had the wisdom to cultivate their drought plan yet. So right now we're dealing with a Pacific that is warmer than average and a Atlantic that is neutral-ish okay? So we're kind of caught somewhere in between this right here and what I guess would be somewhere along the lines of this right here, okay? It isn't a perfect roadmap because our indices aren't exactly strong right now, but it is an idea. To put it in perspective, this was the oscillation setup that got us really in trouble from about 2010 through the spring of 14, okay? This is what fixed it. When we cooled the Atlantic and warmed the Pacific, this is what fixed it, fixed the whole plains. Really, last year at this time, we had less than, I want to say, boy, last spring, less than 18% of the country was dealing with drought at that time. And then you can see where we've gone since then, okay? So let's talk about El Nino, La Nina, whatever. Just give you an update. This is a graph that charts upper oceanic heat content out there in that ENSO region, or where we typically see El Nino or La Ninas, okay? So back in last year at this time, you could see we got a little bit of a bump here with not necessarily El Nino conditions by any means, but it was warmer, and then we just fell off a cliff, and this is where we really started to see things dry out. So again, when that upper oceanic heat content cools off, it's pretty directly correlated with us having problems in terms of dryness in the western and southern high plains. Here recently, we've really gotten a bump back up here toward not necessarily neutral, but we've really started to warm, quote unquote, warm things up a little bit from where we were, and that's an important transition. This is just an animation that I think is pretty cool, and if you watch the date, you'll probably have to watch it here a couple of times, but the date starts back right there, November 9th. So what you're dealing with here is ocean water in the depth, okay, here's your depth over here on the left, so down to about, what was it, about 200 meters over here off the west coast of South America that was cooler than average. Over here, you've got water near Australia, okay, so it's just an east-west thing. I know there's a lot going on here, but it tells a good story. And if you look at how that has transitioned, look at all the cooler than average water and how deep it was, now look at the warmer than average water that's starting to undercut that, and then this starts to shrink. I think this particular animation is significant because it shows you that the La Nina that's going on has basically peaked and is starting to weaken. And it's because of how this water is changing over here. If this warmer than average pool was still over here and wasn't making some progress to the east, I would say we still have a lot more La Nina to go, but that isn't the case. You can see how things are changing, and they've really changed pretty rapidly within about the past 3 to 4 weeks, okay? This, all these things over here on the right side are computer models that are looking at the same thing. They're looking to see whether or not we're going to continue with La Nina or go back to neutral or even go to an El Nino episode. This was done back in mid-December. The new one just came out, so I didn't have time to get that in the presentation for you today. But it shows a pretty similar trend. In fact, this yellow line right here is the mean of all these different computer models looking at the same thing. Over here at 0, that's neutral. -1, that's down here around La Nina territory, +1's up here at El Nino. And the latest one that I looked at just a second ago actually has that yellow line coming up here to toward a weak El Nino status somewhere late in the summer and into the fall. And again, I really caution you to take this stuff at face value, because there's a thing called the spring predictability barrier when it comes to El Nino and La Nina. And simply put, our computer models don't do a great job of forecasting stuff during the spring when it comes to El Nino. It has to do with how the seasons are changing globally. So they struggle a little bit. So once we get into the late spring and in the summer, these types of forecasts will become much more accurate than just speculation like what they are right now. So I'm going to show you some computer models in terms of moisture and what they can expect and what these models are expecting. So all you need to know right here, this particular model, NMME, North American Multi-Model Ensemble. There are 10 models built into this, and then the output is the mean of what those models are suggesting in terms of moisture. So this is for February. Green is good, brown sucks, white is average, okay? That's what you need to know. We've got brown going on over New Mexico, West Texas, and notice again where the storm track is really favoring, where you see the green up here, some parts of the Pacific Northwest, Northern Rockies, and then going to the Midwest. So really, in terms of the jet stream, you're doing something like this, okay? Just like that. Underneath that ridge, that's where you're probably going to be the driest. This is March. Still some issues, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas Panhandle, and some down here along the Gulf Coast. So again, similar type of a pattern that sets up. There's April. Again, some regional problems here. Again, the farther north you go, there's a lot less issues here. And I would, to be honest, I would say you could probably bring that down to about I-70. Just from my experience, when this type of pattern sets up, anything along a north I-70 is usually in pretty good shape. You go south, that's where you run into some difficulties. There's May. You can see things becoming more and more problematic here in the west. No problems here in the Corn Belt, which is significant. June. Again, June's about the time we start shutting things off here. The farther south you go in Texas, so don't look too much into that. You don't get a whole lot of rain central South Texas after we get past June. But you notice that there's still an uptick here in West Texas because of how the monsoon moisture. This would be basically your monsoon plume right here coming out of Mexico, Arizona. A lot of times that will hit New Mexico and West Texas. This particular model is suggesting it might have a problem doing so this year. August. When we get into August, we start talking about hurricane potential. So it just depends on how things play out down here on the Gulf. I don't see anything right away that would suggest the hurricanes season is going to be necessarily below average at this point, nor do I see anything that necessarily say be above average. But if we trend towards a weak El Nino episode, starting late summer, that El Nino tends to suppress hurricane activity in the Gulf and in the Atlantic, so we'll have to watch that pretty closely. Here's another one. This model is a Jamstack model, and I apologize for the chart that it's on, but it's a global plat. But this is MAM, so March, April, May. Again, brown sucks, green is good, white is average. And you can see the area that it's having problems with here, where all the brown is, which is essentially the areas that are seeing drought right now. So it shouldn't come as any huge shock that if we don't tip the scales one way or another in terms of our weather patterns and our ocean setup over the next, say, 2 to 3 months, that the same type of weather pattern that we've been dealing with should persist. Okay? So again, March, April, May. Here's June, July, August. This is when things might actually start to change a little bit. It actually has some green down here across Texas, Texas Panhandle, Oklahoma, even up into my backyard. The problem, at least for me in Colorado, is if we miss out on March, April, May, and I know the same thing for you folks, West Texas, Northern Panhandle area, if you miss out on that March, April, May transition in terms of moisture, it doesn't matter really what happens the rest. You basically, your wheat crop failed and you got to think about what to do for summer and fall crop at that point. And the extremes we've been seeing up in my backyard is we'll get a day at 70 and we'll get a cold front come through and the next day is 25 and the wind blows 40, 50. So that's about as, and it's dry. These fronts are coming through dry. So that's about as bad of a combination in terms of winter weather as you'll get in terms of the winter wheat crop. If we could get some snow on it, that'd be great. That'd help things out a lot because there is a little bit of moisture still underneath there, but it's not in great shape right now. A little bit later, this is September, October, November. A little drier than average here, Arizona, New Mexico, West Texas. But again, we're talking September, October, November, which is quite a ways in advance. And even as a meteorologist, statistically speaking, you're thinking, oh, can you take this at face value? And I'm like, no, you're an idiot if you do. Statistically speaking, if you go out in time, anything you do in the future is going to be less accurate than what you can see close in. So these longer range time slots as far as these models are concerned, again, just simply take with a grain of salt. Or if you have questions about it, just simply ask me. I'm okay with that. Last model I want to show you. This particular model, before I go any further, I will say that this particular model is thinking that the La Nina may hang on a little longer than some of the other models are. And if you follow what I'm thinking here, that this model would obviously be drier than some of the other models. So going through that, just at least know that that's what the model is projecting. But for March, it's pretty similar to the other stuff here. Basically, southeast Colorado down here in the quote-unquote Dust Bowl area, Clayton, Dalhart, over to Amarillo and whatnot, that's where you're looking at drier than average conditions in March. That's April. Same area, but also some expanded reach down here along the Gulf Coast. And again, notice who isn't having any problems. It's like what I talked about with how the ocean's set up out there in the Pacific. Pacific Northwest, Northern Rockies, Corn Belt, right up here, and in the Northeast, no problems. May, similar setup. June, we start to break at least the excessive signal, but it's still very similar to what's been going on. These patterns don't change overnight. So while this setup might be a little more extreme than maybe what some of the other models are suggesting, the setup's kind of the same. Break things down in July, here's your monsoon plume right there, coming up out of Mexico. Some of that is likely going to benefit Texas. Farther east, I think this is probably a little bit too broad in terms of dryness, but you get the idea. August, something that I'm interested in, you see this green right here in the western Gulf, that would suggest probably enhanced tropical activity at that point. So right here along the Gulf Coast, to have it be just so dry, again, I wouldn't necessarily be signing off on that entirely. But again, we're talking about August here. This is quite a ways away still. September, again, probably the remnants of monsoon activity right here, if I had to say that, even up in my backyard. October, some dry signal right there. Notice who probably is reaping the benefits, at least as the model is suggesting, from the tropical activity in the Atlantic and the Gulf, over here around Florida. Okay? So, some of my thoughts here. La Nina is probably, at least in some capacity, going to continue through the spring. I don't see it just completely going away. However, I think it's peaked, and I think it's weakening. Models are still pretty unsure of where we go from here. Do we just hover around neutral? Do we move toward an El Nino episode or whatever? Bottom line though, even when we change state, that's not a guarantee. And here's the problem with regional drought and why I become so concerned about it, because the longer that ground stays dry, the faster it heats up the next day. Heat dries things out if you don't put moisture in it. So that heat dries the ground out even further. You heat that ground up even more, then you mix the atmosphere up to where the wind becomes an issue almost every day. Drought is one of the worst positive feedback mechanisms in atmospheric science because of the damage that it does on a daily basis. So the longer you go without snow cover, especially in southeast Colorado, southwest Kansas, northeast New Mexico, and in the Texas Panhandle, this time of year, the more easily drought creep can continue, and not only continue, but worsen very, very, very quickly. So when you get a regional drought that's going on, that is not something that just goes away overnight unless you can just get this massive one storm that can come in and do that. Is that possible? Well, sure, it's possible. You know, an asteroid could hit the planet tomorrow too. So you understand what I'm saying. But dealing with absolutes and what I can see, I don't see the drought immediately going away. In fact, it's probably going to worsen before it gets better. And this is especially true the farther west you live, across West Texas, New Mexico, the southeast Colorado, southwest Kansas. The farther east you get, statistically speaking, there's always a better chance when storms move through to get better moisture the farther east you go. Closer to the Gulf, there's higher humidity in the atmosphere, so on and so forth. The good thing is that the Pacific is not in a cold state right now, and that does favor drought relaxation at some point. So even if this is more flash droughty from what we've talked about, we're not talking multi-year here because we had such a wet winter and spring last year, and even the first part of summer was in great shape. But this flashy drought where we just shut everything off like this is still significant, especially if it occurs during a period of time when you really need that moisture. And that's why I'm so worried, at least up in Colorado, eastern Colorado, western Kansas, and across the winter wheat belt, that I'm really concerned about March and April failing. And if March and April fail, it's not going to be, oh, we're going to be 60 degrees and no wind. Okay? It'll be, we're talking warmer than average temperatures, and we're talking wind at that time, which furthers the drought, which makes it harder for it to break down, even when the pattern does change. Okay? So do I know when that's going to happen, when that relaxes? Not really, but I would say it'd probably be after the spring, the way it looks right now, if I had to put money on it. So if you got questions, please email me anytime. Some of you guys have done so in the past when I've talked to you, and I've got some great relationships with some of you guys because you really look at the weather information and you sink your teeth into it and have questions. Again, on Twitter if you're looking for it. Also, if you need weather for your business, I'm going to hit, I follow the governor tomorrow in Denver, and I'm sure the governor is going to give a pretty rosy picture for Colorado in terms of economic expansion and in terms of everything just being just fine. Boy, are they going to be in for a rude awakening after he talks and I get up there. Okay? But I don't care. So I don't get paid for an agenda. I don't get paid to say one thing or another. I just get paid to just talk about it. But the problem is that a lot of people, a lot of entities are overexpanding, especially now with the housing market booming and back in business. So many people fail to learn from history and what's eventually going to happen. You know, I'm sure you all are the same way down here in Texas, right? How many people are moving into Dallas every month? How many people are moving into Houston? And then eventually people get tired of the city and they start expanding to other areas and urbanizing more of those areas. And then all of a sudden you go through a multi-year drought and then you don't have enough water. So everybody's looking at the money and the monetary aspect of this and the way the economy is going, but there are very few people that are being commonsensical about the situation and saying, hey, money's great, but if we overextend ourselves so much over here, we're going to get in a hell of a wreck down the road that we won't be able to recover from. So that's kind of my message, not necessarily for you guys today, but also for the folks that I'm going to be speaking with tomorrow. The weather information behind me, again, could it be wrong? Absolutely it could be wrong. It's weather. It's the future. Okay? But I think you guys are smart enough to see what's happening right now in terms of the drought and in terms of what is actually fueling the drought, that we're going to have a little bit of change in the players at the table for the overall weather pattern to change as well. Change as well. Change as well. Change as well.